In the 1950s, America had broken free from the shackles of wartime economics. It was walking with the swagger of a nation that had the world by the tail. Scientists had harnessed nuclear energy. Jet-propelled airplanes were breaking speed records, and the race to space was on. But perhaps more than anything else, one thing melded imagination and consumerism, putting this era in perfect context. The concept car. Unlike satellites, rockets, and jet planes, these dream cars were accessible. People flocked to auto shows to see concept cars in their titanium-bodied glory. They were snapshots of how America perceived its future. They were simply out of sight, unforgettable. But what happened to them? Most were destroyed. Some just plain vanished. But amazingly, some are still here. Introducing the 1933 Dymaxion.
This car was going to be your boat, it was going to be an aircraft. We would fly our Dymaxions into the city, land them, and then drive into town. It was going to radically change the way we lived.
And introducing the 1955 LaSalle Roadster and its sister car, the LaSalle Sedan. Two show cars dug out of a junkyard.
One of the magazines saw a picture of me digging parts out of the ground that had fallen off the car, and they called me an auto archaeologist, and I've always liked that, the term.
It looks like a blimp with 3 wheels. It drives like an out-of-control parade float. The Dymaxion car is the brainchild of Buckminster Fuller, an architect, engineer, artist, and philosopher.
He's probably best known for the geodesic dome, and we see examples of this all over. Probably most notable is Expo 67 in Montreal, the largest dome that he created. But he was very interested in the human condition and a utopian, wanting to improve the life of man all through his career. And I think that was probably the driving force that pushed him on to these things. Buckminster Fuller was working on what he figured was going to be the next radical change in transportation for the American public. He envisioned a vehicle that would take us out of the cities, out of the dirty environment of the large American city, and let you move out into suburbia. His brainchild was to build a vehicle that would not only just drive you along America's byways. This car was going to be your boat, it was going to be an aircraft. You would be able to live far out into the country, and we would fly our Dymaxions into the city, land them, and then drive into town. So it was going to radically change the way we lived. I think he felt that he would be improving the human condition by making available this miraculous machine that would do all these things.
Unfortunately, the technology available in 1933 paled in comparison to Fuller's imagination. He did actually build a car, but the wings never got beyond the drawing board, and the engine had to be brought back down to earth.
This was going to be a jet-propelled car. We weren't quite ready for jets just yet. They were just too theoretical. So he had to settle for something a lot more conventional and basically start from scratch. He eventually decided on using a Ford chassis, an 85 horse V8, which was fairly new for Ford at that time, but it was readily available, and Henry was very amenable to give him what he needed for the project.
It was front-wheel drive, but those wheels didn't turn. Steering was done with the single rear tire.
It's extremely maneuverable. He used to like to do pirouettes around traffic cops in the middle of intersections just to show off how maneuverable the automobile was, make very tight turns and such.
It was fast, too. The Dymaxion was clocked at 125 miles an hour, an astounding speed for the early 1930s.
The Dymaxion is your basic teardrop shape, to use a simplified form. It's very round at the front, tapers at the rear. The three-wheel chassis enables you to do that much more rapidly than your standard old four-wheel chassis that we're dealing with today, so that the car would taper it to the back and to a nice point, and they felt that was a much more aerodynamic look.
It's also light. The frame is made of wood and the skin aluminum. The shape and the weight combined to make it incredibly fuel efficient. It got 30 miles to the gallon, the same as a Honda Civic gets today. That's even more impressive when you consider that it's 20 feet long and holds 11 passengers. It's so roomy inside, it's been called the grandfather of the minivan. Its real name, Dymaxion, is a combination of two of Fuller's favorite buzzwords, dynamic and maximum. Everywhere it went, the car drew a crowd.
It's radically different. People do like different. I mean, that always drags them into something like that. So this is modern, this is fresh, this is crisp new thinking. So yeah, it drew attention, just unbelievably. In fact, it was responsible for traffic jams and all sorts of problems. Several cities didn't like Bucky bringing the car through town at all.
To make the jump from curbside oddity to a commercial reality, Buckminster Fuller had to get his creation in front of serious investors, so he took it to New York City.
He tried to unveil it at the New York Auto Show earlier. They wouldn't allow him space. Some say politics, some say money. Hard to determine, which exactly happened there, but at any rate, Bucky Fuller is not allowed to bring the Dymaxion into the building. He's a pretty crafty fellow. He does know marketing, and he makes a deal more or less with the police department there, where he gets to park the car right at the front door. And so he gets all the attention of everybody that has to pass right by the automobile to get into the show without having to pay any of the goodies to get inside.
Later that year, Buckminster got his big break, but it proved to be short-lived.
On the way past the fairgrounds to the airport to catch the plane that's going to take them to Akron, there's a mishap.
"1933 was a bad year to release a new car.
We, of course, had the stock market crash in '29, but 1933 is really right on the precipice of bad times to come.
To make matters worse, the car Buckminster Fuller was trying to produce that year was wildly unusual. To make his dream a reality, he needed to attract financial backers with deep pockets.
Chicago World's Fair 1933, he brings in investors from Europe, Forbes Semple from Great Britain, Dolphus from France. They fly over on the Graf Zeppelin, and they're going to check out Bucky's marvelous new machine. His driver, Francis Turner, takes them all over Chicago, rides them around so they get a good feel for the car. Everything's going very well, according to most reports. It's time for them to catch the Zeppelin again and head back to Europe with all they've learned on the automobile. On the way past the fairgrounds to the airport to catch the plane that's going to take them to Akron, there's a mishap. official report is that the automobile lost control and rolled. Fuller's people and other witnesses say that the automobile was hit by another car. Whatever the reason was, the automobile did roll. It is a prototype. The structure was not strong enough, so the roof collapsed. It crushed, it killed Turner, seriously injured Forbes Semple and Dolphus. They're both in the hospital. Of course, they can't report what they saw because they're unconscious. It's left to the authorities to draw their own conclusions. By the time Buckminster Fuller's people could make their full case on the automobile, of course, the news is all over the place that the automobile lost control, rolled, killed the driver. That made for a lot of bad press. And a lot of the other would-be investors then started to step back and take a look.
Buckminster Fuller's dream ended with just 3 prototypes ever being built. Car number 1 was destroyed in the crash in Chicago. Car number 3 was last seen 50 years ago in Kansas.
Car number 2 was taken by a disgruntled employee and spirited away for lack of payment. Eventually the car was towed to Arizona and basically considered lost to the world.
Then in the 1960s, an architecture student who had been studying Fuller's ideas at the University of Arizona rediscovered it.
His apartment is on the 2nd floor, and as he goes up the stairs and down the balcony, he's looking into this gentleman's backyard, and there sits our Dymaxion now under a lean-to in very disreputable repair.
It has now been fully restored and is on display in Reno, Nevada. It's a headliner at one of the world's most impressive car collections, the National Automobile Museum.
It has a following amongst people who are big fans of Buckminster Fuller. He has a huge following still today, which I find rather fascinating for a gentleman who's been off the scene now, 25, 30 years.
At the museum, the Dymaxion is a head-turner. Just as it was in its heyday. But as a commercial proposition, it was a failure.
From his standpoint, it failed because it didn't make any great impact on what everybody else did. And I think probably in the end, even if he had not produced any of the cars, stopping at only 3, if the idea had caught fire, if somebody else would say, that's neat, I'm going to incorporate that style, that look, that feel, or I'm going to incorporate that philosophy even into what I'm building. And not even just an automobile, household appliances or what have you. I think then he would have considered it a great success. He put forward the idea, and from what I understand of Buckminster Fuller, that was a success in itself.
The Dymaxion was supposed to radically change the way we live. The LaSalle Roadster was just supposed to be fun. Joe Bortz has always loved cars.
Let's see. Okay, here we go. When I was probably 3 years old, my parents used to tell me that I could just about name the brand of any car driving on the street.
Specifically, he's always had an eye for concept cars.
When I was young, I would go to the car shows, the auto shows. The idea of even being close enough to touch a concept car wouldn't happen because they were always on display in a way that you could never get close enough to touch them. And the idea of owning one was absolutely ridiculous, Be like me thinking I could be a ballet dancer.
He's never performed Swan Lake, but he has amassed one of the most impressive collections of dream cars in America. Collecting concept cars isn't easy. Many were destroyed, shipped overseas, or torn apart and rebuilt into something completely different. The ones that survived all have their own stories. The 1955 LaSalle Roadster and Sedan are no exception.
Automobile Quarterly, a wonderful publication, had done an article on 3 or 4 of my cars. I was showing that article to my son Mark, and there was a sidebar in one of the pages, and it said, "There's been a persistent rumor that at the junkyard known as War Hoops in Sterling Heights, Michigan, that they have some General Motors Motorama concept cars."
So Joe made a phone call.
He asked me who I was, and I said, Joe Bortz. He said, "You're the Joe Bortz that's been collecting these concept cars?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I might have something you want." Well, you know, that was, didn't have to say much more than that. I said, I'll be on a plane tomorrow.
What he saw in the junkyard made his heart race, but it was also heartbreaking.
They're all cut up in pieces, but still, you know, this is like King Tut's tomb. You know, if a vase is broken in pieces, it's still the pieces there. You're going to put them back together eventually. So we got all 4 cars and we brought them back. And that began the 25-year process of restoring the first one.
2 of the cars were from GM's 1955 Motorama show, made under the badge LaSalle. One was a convertible roadster, the other a hardtop sedan. Both of them were a mess. The War Hoops Junkyard Find, as it's been called, presented a huge restoration challenge, but it also gave Joe a chance to one-up the engineers he grew up idolizing.
This is the first time this car has ever been driven on the street.
Joe Bortz is a different kind of car collector.
One of the magazines saw a picture of me digging parts out of the ground that had fallen off the car, and they called me an auto archaeologist, and I've always liked that, the term.
His passion is for finding and restoring concept cars, but that's not what they were called originally.
The word concept car didn't exist in the 50s. All these cars were called dream cars.
In the 1980s, he discovered a crumpled pile of car bodies that had been sitting in a Michigan junkyard for 25 years.
The reason that these cars really do exist today is because they are made of fiberglass. That was the new medium of the day. All of these cars sat outside for decades, and the bodies are fully intact. They're not rusted out.
Joe spent the next 25 years putting them back together. The most famous cars from that junkyard find are the 2 LaSalles. One is a roadster, the other a sedan. They were unveiled at the 1955 General Motors Motorama show, 2 years after the Corvette took the world by storm.
I think the sedan and the roadster served different purposes for testing the public. The roadster was like the Corvette, only smaller, so it was a sports car. And the sedan was really your mid-size compact car in terms of its dimensions. So they served 2 different purposes in that regard, but they were related obviously in design and in color schemes and things like that.
The most obvious difference between the 2 is their roofs. The Roadster doesn't have one, while the Sedan's is made of stainless steel. What they have in common is size. They are 2 of the smallest cars General Motors ever made.
They used 13-inch tires, I think, for two reasons. One, it was innovative, and two, it brought down the height by an inch or two. And of course, lowering cars was definitely the fad of the day.
Today, the Roadster looks exactly as it did in '55. That's thanks to a long and challenging restoration process, one done without any blueprints or instructions.
Basically, if you're missing parts, as the LaSalle Roadster was, you work off of pictures.
The sedan's restoration is still incomplete, and it will probably stay that way.
I always ask people, what's your favorite car? And lately, a lot of people have been telling me that the unrestored LaSalle Sedan is their favorite, and they don't want me to restore it, and they don't want the Bortz Auto Collection to put it into show condition. They want it to be left as a piece that shows how cars are found, and it's an interesting way to look at it.
Joe was a huge fan of the Motorama shows as a teenager. Today, when he displays his cars, he tries to give modern car fans a taste of what he saw in the 1950s. Sometimes even a little more.
It's interesting to note that the two LaSalles, while the engines weren't running, they were scheduled to be powered electrically in the trunk so that they could be driven across the platforms for show purposes. And it was never done. So they showed them as a static display. When we restored the cars, we decided to take it that one step further, and the LaSalle Roadster is electrified in the trunk. And today, for the very first time ever, the public will get to see the LaSalle Roadster in motion on its own power.
This is the LaSalle 2 Roadster. This is the first time this car has ever been driven on the street.
It's not fast, but just seeing it roll down the street in front of a crowd of car lovers means Joe has succeeded in bringing this tiny little car full circle.
I think the purpose that they serve today is the original purpose. You just look at them and you love them.
The rounded shape of Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion car make it either the perfect economy of material and space, or an awkward, bloated, oversized oddity. Similarly, the tiny size of the LaSalles make them either fun, stylish, and sporty, or completely impractical. It all depends on what you're looking for.